years. He was not an openly gay guy. As a matter of fact, he was incredibly good looking. All the girls in town liked him.
And they love to go shopping with him because he has such good taste.
He seemed like one of the the biggest eligible bachelors in town. Calvin Hunt had thought the man in the back seat of the car was Myers, but Myers' mother backed up an alibi that her son had been at Lake Norman near Charlotte on the Sunday that Vernon had gone missing. A number of IOUs were found in Shipman's paperwork at Tempo, totaling about $1,000. Charles had allegedly made a voodoo doll of Frank, and shortly after he had done this, Frank's face was disfigured in a car accident. So much so that he needed plastic surgery after.
Also, he owed him money, and he took him out with a voodoo doll?
Well, he owed Vernon money.
Yeah.
He was always
And
borrowing.
Vernon put the hex on his
No,
ass.
Charles put the hex on him.
Charles.
And from what I understand, it's because Charles was jealous that Frank and Vernon had a relationship.
And the dude was handsome.
Yes.
And his face got
And so
disfigured.
even though they seemingly were like a couple, but in some sort of open relationship, because they both were fucking other people,
Yeah.
Charles was jealous.
Oh.
So he puts a voodoo doll together, basically hexes this guy. He ends up in a wreck, has to have plastic surgery, and Vernon had helped pay for that plastic surgery. Myers knew Charles had put this hex on him, and some said that Frank is the one who had broken into Vernon's house and removed those illicit photos.
Ah.
Though a suspect, he was never charged. Frank died after being shot in a domestic dispute in Charlotte just a few years after this murder.
He done cursed him.
Another suspect was a man named John Shadrick. He was 28 at the time of the murders and had been paroled from state prison in 1966. On the Saturday night before the murders, he was staying at a motel in Hendersonville. In August of 1966, he was arrested for trying to rape another young man using a knife, and he made some threats during the assault. Shadrick told the victim, "I have already killed 3 people, and I'll just as soon kill you too."
My God, they need to put that dude in jail.
A friend of Charles and Vernon was a man named Jim Burroughs, and he was also gay. Many consider him a suspect. At some point, Burroughs admitted to killing the trio, and he said this to the WNC Tribune editor. And if you remember, that's where Charles had his advice column.
Yeah.
He had been a newspaper reporter, but he was an alcoholic, and he had gotten fired from the Asheville Citizen-Times, around the time of the murders. Sometime between the 18th and 22nd of July, Burroughs told an editor that he had a news tip about a triple murder in Hendersonville. And this was around the time he had gotten fired. And this was before anyone knew the 3 were dead.
Oh, well, that's pretty compelling. He'd be like, "Newsflash, I killed 3 people."
3 confessions came out, but none proved to be true.
Think people just wanting to insert themselves in this big case for the area?
Possibly. A chiropractor named Saxman was considered a suspect because of some kind of money dispute he had had with Charles, and he had been friends with Vernon. So that is another person of interest in this case. Never charged. Now, our next suspect is pretty interesting, and we may have to have just a separate episode on this guy.
Just a little bit I saw. I think we can.
Edward Thompson Jr. went on a crime spree in western North Carolina and Virginia, which included rape, murder, and kidnapping.
Yeah, he would sound like a very vicious man. And he, 9 people caught up in his crime spree?
He began his spree in Henderson County, and by the end of his murder spree, 11 people were kidnapped, 5 raped, and 2 dead.
Damn, monster.
He was given a life sentence, and he died in 1989. Many law enforcement officers believe Thompson was the killer. There were similarities between the triple murder in 1966 and the other crimes he had committed. Some similarities in the case: the men were clothed, the women were not. He left the keys and ignitions of the cars of his victims. He made people he kidnapped drive him around. Women got a more brutal treatment. He kidnapped random people, and for some reason, he committed his crimes on Sundays.
Well, that's very strange.
There's a TV show called Haunting Evidence that was filmed in 2007, and they brought in some psychics and mediums to solve the case. The psychic, John Oliver, who was not given any information on this case, described the killer as a black man, which shocked investigators, and we'll get to that here in a moment. The case remains unsolved. Shoddy investigative work, a contaminated crime scene, and lack of information was a big problem. Because the men were gay, associates were afraid to talk for fear of being outed. Louise's life was private. That complicated things. Plus, there was no solid tie to Louise and the two men. Years of investigations have brought in many suspects, tips, but nothing has ever come to fruition. Though retired police chief Bill Powers is certain that Edward Thompson is the guilty person. Though the suspect in the car was described as a white man, Thompson was a very light-skinned African-American with red hair. However, there is no way to use DNA now to tie Thompson to the crime. I mean, at this point, evidence has long been destroyed. He's dead. This case is over 50 years old.
Yeah, and who knows if it was preserved in a way that, to preserve the DNA.
Evidence was thrown into the landfill. The only thing left from the crime scene was one of Charles's crutches. Thompson had also been accused of murder in 1947, but he was never convicted. The charges were dismissed. And some of the sources I used for today's case were the News Times. There's an 8-day series called Small Town Big Crimes. Also, news articles from the Hendersonville newspaper, North Carolina's Search for a Voodoo Killer by Hal White.
I need to read some of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because, and it said Vernon was still a practitioner of African folk religion.
Do you mean Charles? He was the one that...
No, ma'am. No, I mean Mr. Thompson.
Oh, okay. Well, his name was Edward. You're going to confuse people.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, Edward Thompson was also known to be a practitioner of African folk religions, like old religions from Africa. And, a lot of that, which I thought was interesting, you pointed out that some of that believes in what they call juju, which is like amulets and charms and such like that, like do a little spell and get your little amulet to protect yourself. And then the one guy was selling some things like that out of the back of his record store.
Yeah, I would sell like little mojo bags.
Yeah.
Those elixirs.
Right.
Little bags of herbs and spices and different things.
Yeah, known to sell that to African, black people there in town. So that was could be a possible connection there for them.
Yeah, it could be.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting case. I first discovered this case, it's probably been 10 years ago.
Really?
I worked in Hendersonville.
That's a long time to be.
Real estate company.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It was like after the crash, so that didn't go very well. But anywho, working in Hendersonville, and I've always been interested in true crime. Some of the other people I worked with, coworkers, told me about this case. They were like, oh, well, if you like true crime, you should check this out. Started reading up on it, and I was fascinated. I was like, how did I never hear this story before?
Yeah, it's a pretty wild story with there's a lot of parts to that story.
And what's really interesting, too, Louise, her apartment is in downtown Asheville. It was on Ravenscroft. And I'm very familiar with that area, and I'm pretty sure I know where her apartment might have been.
Really?
Yeah. Like the building?
Oh.
Well, that's kind of crazy. We could do a little morbid tour, huh?
Yeah, we get our little camera rig and go out and check it out. Check out that apartment. It's probably totally different now.
So this has been the triple murder, 1966 triple murder in Hendersonville, North Carolina.
Yeah, I bet people talk about that case till this day.
Yeah, I'm sure. It's probably one of the biggest cases in that county.
Well, yeah. I mean, just with all the different parts, the voodoo and the way the bodies were, and 3 people and the strange connections or lack thereof. Very, very strange story.
What do you think happened? I mean, I have to go with the witness who was saying that he had seen multiple men on this road the early morning hours of the Monday after the guys and the gal went missing. Because you had said before, how do you control 3 people?
Yeah, so, yeah. I mean, that totally makes more sense in my head because that's the first thing that jumps out at me. One perpetrator, 3 victims, and the one guy had the boot and the crutches. So, he's a little easier to control maybe, but the other 2 are able-bodied, not hurt. So, yeah, it's just, even for one of them to get away, even if he killed them, to be so far away, he doesn't have time to bring them back, drag them all the way over here and arrange the bodies. So it's like he had them in that spot, got them there, and nobody had a chance to get away. So it really leads me to believe that there was at least one other person, maybe 2 or 3 other people.
Right, I'm trying to play it out in my mind, just reading the details of the case, and I'm like, okay, so the murderer, the suspect, is in the back seat with Louise. The 2 men are in the front seat. If this person whacked Vernon, because he was just killed with a blunt force trauma.
Okay.
Hit him with an object, knocked him out. Charles is probably going to be like, oh my God, And then you could quickly, they said Louise had defensive wounds, like a broken arm and shoulder. So imagine this person reaches over, attacks her, injures her arm and shoulder, gets out of the vehicle, pulls her out, pulls Charles out. She's already wounded, so she's probably not going to be able to get too far, right? Just starts beating the shit out of the both of them, stabbing them.
Oh my God.
But then it makes me think if there are 2 people, there could have been the one person in the vehicle and another person waiting.
You just explained how you would effectively take out 3 people.
No, I'm just explaining from the information how I pictured it going down in my head. That it would, how it can make sense with, one person being the killer.
Yeah, and it was a perfect plan. So you're good at this stuff.
I failed the psychopath test, okay?
Yeah, I know. I remember. I was like, what the fuck?
But it's so fascinating. I mean, we'll probably never have answers. And at this point, the case is so old. I said it had been over 50 years. I mean, it's been over, I guess it has been over 50 years because this was in 66. So, yeah, it's been over 50 years since this murder occurred. At this point, your suspects are probably all dead.
Suspects.
Or the person who actually did it.
Potential witnesses. All you got left is the case file. And, there could have been some, I thought the cops were doing good. Shows what I know. They're actually maybe could have done better. Or just all the circumstances together, people's reluctance to talk to them because of the climate of,
Well, it seemed like they really were doing all that they could given the circumstances.
Right.
And they had quite a few things working against them.
It seems that way. But, that's all you got left. Most of the evidence is gone. For all I know, maybe the original, bulk of the case file is gone, for all we know.
I mean, unless we find someone's, handwritten statement, diary entry, or, a family member comes forward and says, hey, this person confessed on their deathbed, we likely never know,
There's no DNA evidence to even link anybody or, all these years later prove a family member or any of that. So, nope. Unfortunately, sadly, those people were brutally murdered, and we likely will never know why.
Yeah, it just seems so weird to me, too. They went through all of the pomp and circumstance of, posing these people, creating kind of this elaborate scene. It's a pretty dramatic death. I mean, it's not like we just shot these 3 people and dumped them. You're posing them. You're placing items on their person. You're physically attacking the person with a knife, blunt force trauma, so you've got some sort of heavy object. Then you are doing horrific things to this female.
Yeah, and the wounds are described as punctures, so it almost sounds something in the neighborhood of a screwdriver or ice pick or something like that, maybe, or a very small knife, It's, and then left like that. That takes time to do all that stuff.
It does, and, I mean, we're speculating, we don't know, but doesn't it seem like a person who would go to those lengths, that wouldn't be the only murder they would be involved in? I mean, that seems like the work of a serial killer.
Or a ring of voodoo killers that plagued Western North Carolina back then, maybe.
Yeah, I don't know if that
And that's
exists.
how my mind works.
Okay.
All right, so thank you for that. Left me with a lot of questions, but sometimes that happens. And but it's a very interesting case, very brutal. I think a ball bat could maybe not in the car. You can't use the ball bat effectively, really.